and welcome to the webinar. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you all today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity. My name is George Glass, a Senior Vice President in the Cyber Risk Practice, responsible for ensuring the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform used to power our MDR, Managed Detection Response Service, to clients around the globe. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and available after the briefing. We're going to use GoWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and I'll do my best to address any questions at the end. Kroll carried out over 3,000 engagements in 2022, and this gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines. And in this session, we're going to cover using that frontline intelligence in an MDR and response detection response environments. So we're going to cover what intelligence-driven defense is. I'll do a quick overview on detection as code. You'll hear me use that term a lot today. So I'll describe what that is, how that can be used, what we think of as the best detection lifecycle, what a typical detection lifecycle could look like, and then introduce some CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development processes for detections. So what do we mean when we say intelligence-driven detection and response? Well, for us at Kroll, that really means using our offensive security teams, our incident response engagements, and threat intelligence collection to drive detections through our awesome detection engineering function to get detections out for IR engagements and for our MDR customers as well. And there's a number of ways we do this. Of course, that huge wealth of incident response collection is one of the key factors of where we find new and novel TTPs from adversaries. But at the same time, we can call on our offensive security team to test some of the detections that we have, find ways around them. And as part of the threat intelligence team, we're constantly looking for new threats from open source through our online scanning from our malware analysis group as well. And when we talk about detection, what we really mean is a way of detecting badness in some way. Not every single detection will lead to an alert per se. Some of these detections could be fairly loose. We may need to use them as part of a threat hunting engagement rather than as something that drives detection. But what we're absolutely trying to do is at least keep in step with what current TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures adversaries are using when they're attacking organizations. And that could be anything from understanding how new and novel vulnerabilities work and how threat actors are exploiting them, or maybe some changes to some malware and the ways that they are getting that initial access into an environment. And of course, with all of the things that we're trying to detect, we're trying to move left on the cyber kill chain as far as possible. So we're trying to push back as close to initial access as we absolutely possibly can. So some of you may be already familiar with the pyramid of pain. For those that aren't, it was an idea posited by David Bianco, I think sort of around 2013, and it sort of covers how easy it is for an adversary to change parts of their attack flow, parts of their infrastructure, but at the same time, how easy it is to detect on those things. So for example, at the bottom of the pyramid here, we have hashes, IP addresses, and domain names. And these things are trivial for threat actors to change. They just change a character in a script or a piece of malware, and the hash is changed. Rolling through IPs and domains, again, fairly simple. It's not particularly hard for threat actors to change their hosting provider and so on. But again, these are very easy for the threat intelligence team to collect and maintain. Of course, there's a lot of work and effort that goes into that, but the majority of it is automated. And that's what we see as sort of being handled by your typical threat intelligence platform. And anyone that's heard me speak about this stuff before, you'll know that we're a big lover of the MISP platform here at Kroll. and that's what we use to drive a lot of the sort of the atomic indicators of compromise that you'd commonly see as part of any attack. And I think this kind of section of detection and response has kind of been done a lot of times before, and what we're really trying to focus on recently is the top of the pyramid, the hardest stuff to detect and respond to, but also the hardest stuff to change from a threat actor perspective. So looking at sort of network and host artifacts, there's certain log files that they have to touch to achieve their objectives. The types of tools that they use, deploying the tools, how the tool operates, changing tool sets can be pretty hard. Threat actors often focus on things like cobalt strike and brute ratel and things like that, and they'd be reticent to change from using those things that they're already very familiar with. And then at the very top of the pyramid, the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, typically covered by the MITRE attack framework, things that the threat actor probably needs to do to achieve their actions and objectives, like dumping LSAT, for example, to get credentials and so on. And that's what I'm really here to talk to you about today, is how we can drive the intelligence that we're getting, be it from IR or from any sort of threat intelligence team you may have. Maybe they've got some information from open source, some changes in TTPs, and use, specifically in this case, detection as code as a way of driving detection through the detection lifecycle as quickly as possible, so that we can keep up to date and keep iterating on those detections. So there are some challenges. I mean, there's always going to be challenges with these things, and this is just sort of some stuff that we've noticed is kind of common in the industry. And of course, no presentation would truly be complete without an XKCD comic to cover the particular things that we're talking about. There's always one for something. And the main things that we're trying to fix and change people's ideas of is, firstly, how detection logic and the documentation are typically in separate silos. Maybe different teams are responsible for those different areas. There could be a disconnect between detection logic and the documentation about the detection. Maybe a detection has changed, but the documentation hasn't necessarily. And there's a particular sort of reliance on spreadsheets, or spreadsheets of doom. It doesn't end well in a dynamic and fast-paced delivery approach. At least if you're not using some of the CI/CD things that we're going to talk about later. That also means that there's typically a lack of versioning and change control. If you have a spreadsheet, anyone can go and change something. It's very hard to get sort of a good view of what's changing and when. Another big problem is there's dozens and dozens of query languages now, and maybe you have a smaller internal SOC and you want to onboard a new piece of technology. Yeah, you've got to get everyone trained up on that new technology, change all of your detections to fit the query language of the new tool that you've just acquired, and that could be very tough. Any custom rules that you make for specific vendors as well, maybe that means that you won't change your vendor because you're locked into those specific query languages. And then one of the main things that we're trying to change is the time gap between new intelligence being created. So maybe you've come across something online, or there's a particular change in the way that some malware works, and you need to know if you can detect on it. There's typically a pretty big lag between those things in the traditional way of handling detections. So earlier I talked about detection as code. So what is detection as code? Well, detection as code is a detection written in a templated and structured format. Now, there's lots of different definitions that people may choose to use. Obviously, there's a huge sort of community around Sigma, and that's a way of sort of abstracting detection logic into a YAML format, kind of like what you can see here. This is an example of one that we have internally. It's not exactly in Sigma format. This one is specific for Sentinel-1, but you get the idea, right? It's a way of having human and machine readable detection logic mapped to as much information and metadata as you possibly can in one single file, which is typically managed in a code repository with all of these things combined in a single view. And as you can see, this is absolutely human readable. We've got a nice description up there about SOC Ghoulish, some references to what what we've seen in the past, what led to that detection being created. There's a date when the detection was either created or changed, and there's other metadata in here as well. How should this alert be treated? What's the fidelity of the alert? And are there any tags we want to include along with this? In this case, we try to tag it with micro attack wherever possible. It just helps with mapping on the back end, which I'll show you later. And in this particular one, you can see quite clearly there the log source. We want to look at process creation logs for Windows products. And then even if you didn't have a fantastic understanding of the Sentinel-1 query language, you can get a pretty good idea of exactly what we're trying to see here. With W script and C script execution of JS and VBS files and so on. So what the idea of all of this is to make it so that these detections are standalone enough so that they can be quickly and easily changed through a CI/CD pipeline, but also can be read by a machine and automated through a detection flow lifecycle. And what does that life cycle look like? So this is what we think is a pretty good example of a detection life cycle. Now, it looks like a cycle. I'm going to refer to it as a cycle, but realistically, a lot of these things could probably happen in parallel once you get up and running. So, being a threat intelligence guy, of course, the threat intelligence comes first. You need to know what you need to detect on before you start detecting it. So that threat intelligence, as I said before, could come from anywhere. Typically for us, it comes from our IR engagements, our red team. And then we need to move on to developing that detection, working with the detection engineering function to figure out what the art of the possible is and where in that sort of threat intelligence process we can start building a detection. We then need to validate our detection, and you'll hear me talk about this more a little bit later on. But as we're thinking of everything as code, would you push code to production without unit tests for it? I hope not. And it's the same with the detections. So we want to be able to validate that the detection works in a sandbox maybe, or ideally with a separate piece of attacker's code where you can use an automated framework to simulate that attack and identify that your detection actually works for the thing you're trying to detect. Then we need to deploy the detection. And again, ideally, if you're using sort of CI/CD processes, this should just be, just a git push to a repo. And then that repo will take that new push and deploy that code out to whatever detection technologies that you may choose to use. Then comes the sort of more interesting side. What we do is ask our red team to go and test those detections, see if there's any way that they can get past them, and that sort of works its way into a purple team kind of scenario, where the red team are actively trying to bypass the detection in some way. Maybe they've seen the detection, maybe they haven't, and we want them to basically break them as much as possible, so that we can preempt what a threat actor may do, and then act accordingly. Maybe change the detection, maybe add other detections around that. It could be any of those sort of scenarios. And then, of course, there's a review process. How well is this detection doing? Typically for that, we rely on the SOC to say, is this generating a bunch of false positives for you? As part of the validation and the detection development process, typically we threat hunt with the new detections to see if there's anything we may have missed previously. And in so doing, we get a good idea of, is this going to cause a lot of false positives and aggravation for the SOC. So let's take an example. Let's do a case study here. And again, I'm presenting, so I get to choose what we talk about. And it's Quackbot again. For those that have seen it before, I love to talk about Quackbot. And in this particular example, we've got a pretty new Quackbot TTP, and this is something that we worked on to build new detections for. So the attack chain works as follows: a typical sort of Quackbot reply chain phishing email with a link in it. That link downloads a zip file. And that zip file actually contains a renamed WordPad executable, named to be like a document, say like, invoice.exe or something like that. And it also contains a malicious EDP util.dll. And the idea here is, from the actors behind Quackbot, is that WordPad will dutifully load that malicious EDP util in a technique known as DLL sideloading or DLL hijacking from any directory that it's running in. So WordPad will always search the directory that it's running from first to see if those DLLs are in there. And if there's a malicious version of that DLL, well, it will dutifully load it and execute any code within it. That malicious DLL will then call a Kroll command, which downloads the Quackbot DLL, disguises a .png file, and then execute it with run DLL32, and Quackbot is installed and running on the machine. So immediately, I'll preempt a couple of questions that you might have, which is why not just detect on Quackbot? Well, you could, but as I said before, we need to push left as much as possible. We want to catch the initial access as much as we can before we work on detecting Quackbot. Of course, there are detections in place for Quackbot, but what if a different threat actor used this same methodology to deliver another piece of malware? Or what if Quackbot works the same on a Monday, and then on a Tuesday there's a new version of Quackbot that acts totally differently? So again, it's all well and good being able to detect Quackbot, and that's absolutely valid detection, but as much as possible, we're trying to push left with all of this stuff. And so, if we go and look at this from sort of an indicator of compromise point of view, some traditional IOCs, some hash values, IPs, domains, yeah, we may detect some of the phishing emails. We may be able to detect some of the links that it goes out to. But what we really want to do is look at the processes that are going on the machine, of course. So we'll be looking at the WordPad process. Maybe it's running from a strange directory. Maybe it's running, running with the wrong name. Of course, we've got the EDP util, again, running from probably the downloads directory, something like that. Maybe we could use that as a strong detection for this technique. So we could probably build a pretty good alert around that behavior. Then we've also got this curl command. Again, that executing may not be necessarily malicious in and of itself, but combined with maybe some other intelligence as an indicator of compromise, an IP, a domain, a hash of the Quackbot DLL, that could also potentially lead to another detection. And of course, we've got the run DLL32 execution. That again is a really good way of detecting the actual execution of the malware. So we've got a number of opportunities here where we could use this capability to build a pretty rapid detection around this and then deploy it. So that's all well and good. We want to move on and develop our detection. But as I mentioned before, there's any number of different languages that you may need to support. This is just a cross-section of some of the examples. And in this particular example, we've simplified it somewhat, and we're just looking for the JABZ string, which is the base64 encoded $S for encoded PowerShell commands. And you can see here across all of these different EDR syntaxes that particular string could show up in any number of different ways. And if you're supporting maybe a number of these products, as we do, that can quickly get confusing. You have to do a new detection for each and every single one of these EDR platforms, and so that can get pretty tiring pretty quickly. And that's where the idea of detection as code comes in. And this is an example of a Sigma rule. And you can see here just how easy it is to understand what that detection is trying to do. Again, as I said earlier, what the particular category of log source you're looking for, again, process creation in this case. And you can see pretty clearly here from the human readable format of this, we're looking for PowerShell and for command lines that contain JABZ. And then we'll let the automation handle the rest of it. The automation can handle all of the conversion that needs to take place. All we need to focus on as threat intelligence practitioners and as detection engineers is getting the high level logic of what we want to detect on, and let the automation worry about everything else. So that's some of the power of the Sigma rule or detection as code. It doesn't have to be a Sigma rule. This is just an example to show just how powerful it can be to lay out your rules in this way. So let's move on to validation. We want to validate our detection. We want to make sure that, hey, is this thing going to detect what we actually want? Does it perform against a simulated version of that TTP? Can we do exact simulation, and can we do bypass attempts on this detection? Could I encode it in a different way? Or if we're looking at a particular piece of malware, we should deploy that detection to that sandbox and execute the malware sample in that sandbox as it would arrive into any user's inbox and execute that flow and see if we can detect it. So that's the simulation part of it. And I'll go on to a bit more detail about how you can use attackers code in just a second. But some other ideas that we use here at Kroll are typically we try to add new and maybe looser detections to the emerging threat feed, which is a sort of a test in the real world, but in a non-alerting way. So we can get an idea of how many alerts this thing may be generating that are false positive, and exactly how noisy it is, and then tune it as needed to get a tighter detection there. And finally, as well, again, something very near and dear to my heart is we now have a point-in-time detection for something that we didn't previously have a detection for. So we should threat hunt across other environments for that same logic, right? We have a detection now, but we didn't have it 2 weeks ago. So we should use this detection wisely and then hunt backwards through time to see if we can identify any other ways that has been exploited maybe previously in the past. And that's all part of the validation life cycle for this thing. And as I said, all of these things can absolutely happen in parallel, and they don't need to be done in sort of a piecemeal manner. And we typically run these sort of sections all at the same time. But once we've got that, we've got an idea of what the detection is. We know that it's fairly tight. It's probably worthwhile, and again, this is something that we can do as a practice, to develop an attackers code in much the same way as we would for the detection, right? So we can test this as a unit test for that detection. So maybe we've done a threat hunt and we haven't found any other examples of this thing running anywhere else. So as part of that simulated TTP exercise, we want to deploy some attackers code to simulate that exact behavior at an exact time, so we can know the detection functions as intended. And this is one of the most important things, I think, to this sort of CI/CD detection as code approach. And I mentioned it before. Would you deploy code without having a unit test for it? I hope not. And so in that way, I think it's a really strong way of thinking to deploy attackers code to a simulated environment, so you can detect all of these detections, and you know that when that thing does happen, then that's actually going to go off. And sometimes the easiest way of doing that is just to deploy attackers code to a simulation framework like FAST that we use internally, or Atomic Red Team, or any number of these sort of attack simulation frameworks there are. Again, as a piece of code, again, in this case, it's JSON, it's YAML, it could be JSON or any number of other things, just to make sure that your detection is doing exactly what you want that particular detection to do. So then it comes to deploying the detection, and because we're using detection as code, this is an example of what we do here internally. And really all this means is that they push to the GitHub repo. Once that pull request has been validated and someone's checked it and been peer reviewed, it's mirrored to our AWS cloud environment. Each of those changes are pushed to an SNS queue, and then we have a bunch of Lambda functions, or serverless functions that just go and pick up that new detection and convert it to whatever piece of technology we need it to work on. And as I say, those particular functions may be different depending on what the platform needs to be. Maybe it's not all coming from one change to one repo, maybe they're in separate repos, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. This deployment process doesn't mean someone copy and pasting from a spreadsheet over and over again. And it doesn't mean that someone has to validate that they've made it to all of those different platforms. This automated framework just takes that YAML file, does the conversion as it needs to, and sends it up to the cloud. And that's a really, really huge time saver when it comes to looking after hundreds of systems. And now, you may think, okay, maybe we don't need to use that for a smaller operation. But again, this automated workflow just means that things just tend to work rather than relying on maybe human copy and pasting, which can be prone to error and so on. This is something that we run on pretty heavily here at Kroll. So what are some of the awesome byproducts that you can get from structuring your detections this way? So this is something that we again use internally, and it's one of those sort of metadata hacks that we have. Because of the metadata that we're including with those detections, we can use the mapping for each of those detections, in this case CR0805, that particular detection. I just chose that pretty much at random. It is a detection for a specific piece of EDR tooling, as you can see here, but we know that detection works for crackbots. If you wanted to simulate a attack scenario from, say, a certain threat actor, or a group of initial access brokers, such as those behind crackbots, you can easily do so by running the attack simulation the opposite way round. And then you also have a really good idea of where your detections lie, both on the MITRE attack framework and for specific pieces of malware as well. So you can understand where the detection maybe covers certain parts of the MITRE attack matrix, maybe other places where you may need to spend some more time building detection. And it also means that for those that are triaging those detections as they fire, they also get all of this information just delivered to them as part of the detection, right? They can understand, okay, this detection is for dealing with this specific TTP that crackbot once had, again using Kroll, and I know that it's working for these particular detection technologies, and I know when it was created and when it was updated, and so you get a better idea of exactly what the detection has been built for. Again, an idea of the fidelity. This is a pretty good detection, between 50 and 70% true positive detection. Okay, yeah, the severity of it's high, again, because it's mapped to Quackbot, a famous initial access broker for this Blackbuster ransomware group. This should be treated as a high severity incident and investigated. And again, all of this stuff is basically free from adopting that process of structuring your detections in that way. So what if we want to red team this? This is an example of a pretty complicated attack simulation. I won't go into too much detail on this because it's just designed to give you an idea of all of the different ways an attack can take place across the whole of the kill chain. But using the structure of the detections that we have in place, we should be able to predict where exactly we can detect an attack in progress, in this case, a red team attack in process, and really stage our response in accordance to that. So as you can see here, the green dots are where detections have fired for certain malicious actions or potentially malicious actions. And most of them are over on the left-hand side, sort of early on in the attack flow, in the attack timeline, sorry. But again, there's a number of different places where we are ensuring that there is detection for each of these attacks taking place, and it's a really good way of understanding your coverage holistically from where your current detection corpus lies. If there was a piece of this red team, let's say, I think it's here, yeah, this LFAS dump. Okay, there's not a detection for that. Why did that detection not fire? Is our detection, not working for that particular piece of technology? There could be any number of reasons. Are we collecting the right log sources, so on and so forth? but it is very easy to understand where your gaps in detection lie. If you simulate an attack, you know exactly when each part of that simulation is going to happen and when an alert should fire. And if alert fails to fire, you know what part of the attack you need to look at and what detections you need to build to mitigate that. And this is just an idea of sort of bringing everything together in sort of a CI/CD pipeline, as it were. And again, this is sort of the idea is that this can be used as a purple team, as both a red and a blue exercise here. So going from the beginning, we need to gather our intelligence first. As I said before, you don't know what you need to detect until you know what you need to detect, right? So that pipeline of intelligence is fed into the detection engineering function, who work on building detections for any indicators and observations that you may have. In our case, as I said before, typically a lot of that comes from our IR work, where a new novel technique is discovered or something along those lines. The detection engineering function work on that particular ticket and then commit that to the source code management platform. In our case, we use GitHub. And then as a byproduct of pushing to that GitHub repo, it's automatically added to the detection database, which is something that the red team can read for TTPs to use for adversary simulation. They can also use that to bypass those detections, as I said before. They can use that information for understanding where the current state of the art is in detection. There's a lot of work that goes on around sort of bypassing EDR and so on and so forth. And that's a really good way of understanding where there could be gaps in your detection methodology by just leveraging red teams for that, but in a purple team frame of reference. And then that automatic process again triggers the build to the testing and staging environment. So putting it into maybe a sandbox, simulating an attack with malware or attack simulation tools. And once those simulations have happened and everyone is happy with the capability of those detections, the threat hunts have been conducted and so on and so forth, we can deploy that into production, which is where the SOC monitoring comes in. Is this detection still worth its salt? Do we need to change anything about it? Is it now all of a sudden generating false positives? Because totally legitimate software may change some of the ways that it works. Maybe, for example, a legitimate piece of software uses curl to download its updates, maybe, and that's triggering one of the alerts that we have for that curl execution. That's absolutely possible. It happens every day. Do we need to change those detections as time goes on? And that's why it's a life cycle rather than a linear thing. Detections can be good for months, maybe even years at a time, but I'd be surprised if all detections worked until sort of the heat death of the universe. There's always going to be change needed, and there's always going to need to be reviews. And so that brings us to sort of the key takeaways that I want you to sort of take home from this presentation. First things first, threat intelligence drives better detection, which drives better response, which drives better threat intelligence. The more that you can detect and respond to, the more nuances of an attack that you may be able to pick up further down the line. Instead of just missing 5 or 6 different things at once, maybe there's only 2 detection opportunities after that fact, but nevertheless, that's driving better threat intelligence. Or if a threat actor bypasses all those detections, again, you're learning from that experience and you can change your detection methodology accordingly. The threat landscape today, it demands multi-platform support and flexibility. Maybe you're supporting EDR platforms, maybe you're supporting network detection and response tools, maybe you're supporting a SIEM as well, firewalls even. All of these things can benefit from some of the ideas that we've been sharing today. Detection as code, it's a great way of merging logic, metadata, and validation. And by detection as code, we sort of believe it's the whole thesis of detection as code, not just deploying detections into a Git repo. It's the whole sort of way of thinking about it that brings all those things together, and you can benefit from the rewards of spending the time doing that. The CI/CD process drives all of this quickly from the front lines of maybe IR or something that you've discovered from open source investigation to all of the monitored environments. A source of some personal pride for our team is, in some of these cases, we've been a couple of weeks ahead of sort of the state of the art of some detection in these cases, because it's come from a real investigation that happened on day 0, and maybe by day 1 or sometimes day 2, we have a detection in place, and there's maybe a lag of between sort of 10 and 14 days before we start to see that picked up by other vendors and used in their detection platforms as well. So we know this works. We know it can be very, very quick. Just everyone needs to get behind the idea of doing it in this way. And then finally, developing and testing these attack scenarios and playbooks can ready defenders for seeing those real world events, right? So if you want to simulate the TTPs of a particular threat actor, and you've spent your time building your detections for that particular actor, maybe it's a ransomware group, you can simulate those attack scenarios with a red team or an automated tool in some cases, and use that experience as a purple team exercise to prepare your security operations team and your defenders to be ready to respond to the real thing. And I think that's a really, really important takeaway from all of this, is developing your attack simulation and your detection in parallel is a huge benefit of thinking about things in this way. And I'm afraid we've run out of time today. I think there's a couple of minutes for questions. Trying to go through that as quickly as possible. But a big thank you to everyone who's taken the time to tune in. I do hope you've found the session informative. We'll be holding our quarterly threat landscape report on August 23rd, where we'll be exploring some of the key insights and critical issues that organizations should be aware of. And you can register using the link in the chat. Just a couple of extra things before we go into questions. When you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare just a few moments, I'd really appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on this session. It helps us prepare for future ones as well. But once again, thank you very much for joining me today. I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon for some of the future briefings. And with that, I will open the floor to any questions that we may have got. Let me just check my my list here. So I have a question here. What agents are used on endpoint, and do you protect cloud workloads? So at Kroll, we support a number of endpoint agents: Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, just to name a few. We're very sort of platform agnostic, and again, that's one of the benefits of using detection as code, is we can build the detection once and then change that detection as necessary to fit any new product that we may need to support. And to answer the second part of that question, do you protect cloud workloads? Yes, if the logging is available to us and it's taken into a SIEM platform, we can absolutely do that. Or if we need an endpoint agent on the cloud compute, of course, that's absolutely possible as well. Just one other question I think we've got here. Typically, how long does it take to create a rule for new TTPs? Yeah, that can differ from case to case. It really depends on the complexity of the TTP that we're trying to cover. For example, that Quackbot example I showed earlier, I'd say no more than a day to build and validate that detection, and then hunt it and deploy it to production. Whereas some more sophisticated TTPs, especially stuff that could potentially be very heavy on the false positive side of things, can potentially take significantly longer, maybe up to a week or so, to get that really tight and ready for production. But nevertheless, it can still be used as an indicator of an attack from a sort of threat hunt perspective, or something to just constantly monitor. So not all detections are ready for prime time straight away, and that's just how some of these things go. But I'd say, yeah, between a day to sort of 5 days would be the maximum time frame there. I think that's everything. So yeah, once again, thank you very much for joining me today.